Well, good afternoon. Truly a pleasure. Michael, congratulations to you, your team. Yeah, what I'm going to talk about today is really representing everybody's work, everybody's in this audience. And I always like to remind myself that we're able to do what we're doing because of pioneers, many of which who are in this room, who believed in this field for 30, 40 years, quietly continuing, allowing this field to incubate, and as we believe now, reaching this inflection point where it's starting to accelerate. So we must never forget that before everybody else got on the bandwagon, people like myself wouldn't be here if it wasn't for these pioneers. I know many of you are in this room. Eric from the Buck Institute, Aubrey, and others, and several members of my team are here. Now, I mention that because I can't stay for the whole 2 days, but for follow-on, there will be at least one or two members of my team from Hevolution here. We have people from our partner institutions as well. But let me talk a little bit about what Hevolution's mission, our vision is, and it's very simple. It is to expand healthy lifespan for the benefit of all. We're a nonprofit. We do invest, but all of our profits go back into the foundation. And our mission is not only to find the breakthroughs, but if we're going to have 4 billion people benefit as a regular client, you can't do that if you can't figure out how to scale it at a cost that the individual and the societies and governments can afford to pay. Ultimately, it's going to take all of those sectors to participate. So I personally don't like to use the term longevity because people misunderstand it as living longer. We have figured out how to live longer. What we haven't figured out is how to live longer, healthier. And so the biggest gap right now is not simply extension of life, but extension of healthy life. And that is what Hevolution is focused on in both funding science and investing. That's what we talk about. To make that point, if we look at the differential between life expectancy and years of health, doesn't matter where you live in the world, interestingly, whether you live in Africa, Asia, Europe, or North America, you're on average going to spend 10 years of your life with some form of chronic disease that is age-related. The healthcare cost burden of that is massive. No other country needs to look at this any more so than the United Kingdom, Western Europe, Scandinavia, including right here in Germany, whether we're talking about Japan, China, Taiwan, Singapore, all of these countries, and now increasingly the US, their health systems can no longer be sustained financially because of the costs of diseases related to aging. Aging in this field is not a nice to have. It is not being driven just for social causes. There is an economic benefit. It's an economic imperative that governments can no longer support our health systems the way they are. For developing countries that don't have nationalized health systems, like many countries in Africa, many countries in Asia, let us remind ourselves they're still pay-forward systems. A young generation personally pays to take care of their older generation, whether it's parents or grandparents. That is not sustainable simply because the demographics is changing so fast. So look all the way to the right. That 10-year period of poor health is worth trillions of dollars. We estimate, based on calculations, that each 12 months of compression of that year in the US alone is probably worth about $4 trillion of GDP. If you extrapolate that around the world, we are talking about really serious impact on GDP that we're already paying for today. We need ministers of finance to start to understand this, not just the ministers of health. I think one of the challenges we've had as a field, we've been talking to health ministers alone. We need to get the finance minister to understand that this has actually got direct return on GDP and impact and therefore needs to be invested in, not just by the private sector, but also by the public sector, and I'll talk about this in a minute. Now, the global demographics is the driver of this. If we think about life expectancy, yes, it has gone up, and look at the way the demographic of the world is going to change as we move forward. This graph here shows you on the vertical axis age, and of course the horizontal axis the numbers of people in each of these age categories. It used to be a pyramid. That pyramid is gone, it's becoming a cylinder. And in many countries, for example, in China and other parts of Southeast Asia, Japan, 40% of its population is over the age of 60 now. That is having profound impact not only on healthcare costs, but the workforce. Fewer and fewer young people are expected to support more and more older people. And the answer is not, let's not do anything about it. That's not an option. And this is a major driver of this. By the way, if this looks a challenge, look on the right. The number of people over the age of 60 is going to go from 1 billion people today. By 2050, will be 2 billion people. Imagine 1 billion more people, quote, retirees needing health care that are not contributing directly to the taxpayer base. That's the challenge, as well as the morbidity. Now, let's take a look at age-related diseases. Look on the left-hand side. Every major disease that we generally look at in the broad population, whether it's cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, dementia, take your pick. The inflection point occurs, as you see on the horizontal axis, at different ages, but each of them increases in prevalence and incidence with time, with age. If you live long enough, you will get, on average, one of these diseases, and if you start to look at how these lines overlap each other, you're going to have multiple of these, and if you cure one of them, you will succumb to another. In fact, the cancer data suggests that if you treat and cure all known cancers, life expectancy of the population is likely not to increase by more than 3 to 4 years. That's it. Because the other disorders are also either being incubated or already present. So our classical system of academic research, of healthcare delivery, has been to focus on every one of these diseases in isolation. The reality is there's a common soil hypothesis. There's something underneath this that affects all of us, ultimately to get 1, 2, 3, 4, or multiple of these disorders. So the question is, do you figure out how to treat the disease when it happens? Or as many of the entrepreneurs in this room, many of the scientists in this room are asking a different question, which is, can we address the underlying biological process? It may express itself in different ways in different individuals, but the underlying process, there is a consistent pattern. And what are those? Now, you can get into the so-called hallmarks of aging, whether you look at senescence or epigenetics, take your pick. The reality of it is, and this is a personal belief, it's probably not just one driver. And probably the personalization of this is going to be combinations of those drivers if we can figure out which individual is being affected by which of those processes more than another and which combination. Yes, ChatGPT and AI is going to help us answer that question, but one caution, all AI looks at the past and extrapolates it to the future. If we look to the scientific literature today and extrapolate to the future, we're not going to get the answer. Because the historical learning data set has not asked that question in principle in a way of addressing this underlying process. We're going to have to start to really rethink so-called how do we change these rules. Now, as finance ministers have been telling health ministers for a long time, increasing your budget doesn't change anything. Look to the right. On the vertical axis there is shown health-adjusted life expectancy. On the horizontal axis is costs per capita. You, after the first 25% of investment on that curve, you can continue to increase your health budget for your population almost exponentially. It has little impact on the population's health. The United States is that dot all the way to the right. I won't even hazard a guess where Germany and the European Union is. I assure you it's not all the way to the left. So the reality of it is we have to start asking ourselves, increasing our health budgets and doing the same is not working. I think it was a German scientist who's supposed to be quoted to have said, if you keep doing the same thing, don't expect a different outcome. Correct? That's unfortunately the approach we've tended to take as a society. Not a criticism not to invest in healthcare, but investing in healthcare the way we've been doing it isn't answering the problem. And that's one of the things we have to ask ourselves. This is where entrepreneurship comes in. This is where private capital comes in. This is where innovation comes in. Because the risk takers who are in this room are asking a different question. What if I come at it differently? That is less likely to come out of public sector alone. We have to come at this together and show the public sector what is possible, and then bring them along. It's going to take both, and that's what I'm going to talk about, why Hevolution operates the way we do. This is not a developed world challenge. In fact, Africa is predicted to have the largest population in the world of old people in the foreseeable future. China already is there, Japan is there, I've mentioned these other countries, but it is now a global challenge. The only difference is today, many of these poor countries do not have the infrastructure to take care of a sick old population. They don't have it. In fact, the challenge globally is indeed that these countries are going to become they're going to become old before they become rich. Rich countries getting old have built the infrastructure. Poor countries getting old do not have the ability to invest to create that infrastructure. And they're getting old fast. The number of years of that aging change in demographics is getting compressed from decades to less than 10 years, as we're observing. If you want to see a haves and have-not divide in a divided world, imagine if you figure out solutions how to keep your population healthy in wealthy developed countries and do not figure out how to democratize those technologies for less wealthy countries to be able to take those, whether it's India, China, or Africa, the productivity divide that I just talked about, trillions of dollars of GDP, will only widen. You cannot expect global stability when access to basic healthcare and maintaining functionality is not available to large populations. So we have two mandates, I would submit. One is to figure out the solution, and the second is to figure out how to democratize it. They're not the same problem. You cannot do the second without the first, but you need the public-private sector to come together, private sector working with government to figure out the first, and then how to scale it to become a public health implementation, not for the elite few, which is exactly when Hevolution was created. Our vision was for the benefit of all, regardless of who you are, where you live, and what you believe in. That has got to be a critical part of what we collectively have to do. Now, let me talk a little bit of Middle East. I get a question often saying, why is the Middle East interested in this? Beyond the humanitarian answer, there's a very direct answer. If you look at the birth rate of countries in the Gulf, yes, today the population of Saudi Arabia, the largest population in the Gulf, is approximately, the average age is the following. 50% of the population is under 25. 60% of the population is under 30. So young population, lots of workers, all the rest of it, not very unwell, low demand on the healthcare system. However, two facts. One, the birth rate in Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries is now just around 2.2. The replacement rate of a population is 2.17 per couple. Well, guess what? The population is no longer going to be continuing to organically grow. It is now stabilized for good reason. Women are educated, they're in the workforce, the economy is strong. All the drivers that are good reasons for the birth rate to fall have occurred. Not they will happen in the future, they happen now. So we have a young population that's a cohort, and it's going to age in place. The second, and the evidence for that, just to take a look at the graph on the right. In fact, the young population peaked around 2010. For the last 15 years, this population has gradually now started to age, as you can see. This is not new. Work we've done at Hevolution is start to quantify from public health data what's going on. What is important are the following statistics, though. Number one, on average, people in the Middle East, in Asia, and in Africa get age-related diseases, on average, younger than Caucasian white populations. They get diabetes earlier. Some of it's related to obesity, but not all. Genetically, there are increased risks of diabetes. We've known that. Now we're seeing increased prevalence and earlier age of onset of cardiovascular disease, age-related cancers like colon cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, now dementia. Everything you would predict in that sequence is starting to occur, on average, 5 to 10 years younger in these populations. So now imagine taking that across India, Asia and Africa, the populations, as they age, are going to see the brunt of that aging process almost a decade earlier. They're not going to have that time. Something has to be done now. This is an example of some of the data that we're now starting to see as what's going on. Of course, we saw obesity first, we saw diabetes follow that, the others are coming. So how do we think about it? Well, everybody in Europe and the UK knows, and in the US, our healthcare system is the top. You're well, and you get a chronic disease, and then you go get treated for it. Talked about that. How do we get to this bottom? You're well, you're thinking about prevention, not just as getting your vaccines and your DPT, but actually prevention from an aging perspective. How do you get to think about preventing and delaying the onset of those chronic diseases so that you do see a population that is aging healthily? That gives you more time, you remain healthier, you remain more productive. That has implications for our society. Everything from what age should we, if people are productive, should they be retiring at 60? What does that mean to our educational system? Do you get to start another career? Do you get to train your population again? Some countries, like Europe, actually have better retraining programs than others. One of the things we're thinking about in North America, we have a much less developed retraining infrastructure, but nobody's doing it exactly as might be needed. What does this mean for health insurance, life insurance, all of those things that we've traditionally built around a population that's going to retire at 60, die at 75, and spend 10 years sick? This has implications for the financial sector, industrial sector, all of those things. The return is huge. Now, how do we think about it? I've talked about the socioeconomic issues, the infrastructure. Are our cities designed to take care of 40, 50% of your population over 60? Is the food industry making foods for older people with their preferences? Is the fashion industry ready for that? All of these are questions, but I also look at them, I've worked in 3 different industries, they're huge opportunities. This is where, if 40% of your clients are over the age of 60 in your population, you're in the fashion industry, do you think about it differently? If you're in the food industry, do you think about it differently? Anybody here who's in their 50s and 60s, I guarantee you, your personal preferences have changed, even if you've remained healthy. And what does that mean for entrepreneurs? Let me talk now then on the tech and the capital side, the bottom 2. What is Hevolution? I think I've touched on it. We're global. We currently are headquartered in Riyadh. We have an office in Boston. We will be opening an office within the next 12 months in the UK European system. I used to say UK Europe in one word. I won't get into politics. I now say UK and Europe. But from a science point of view, there's no distinction. The ultimate thing here is how do we think about this globally? Our vision, I've mentioned to you, is very clear, and our ambition is that we want to be a significant convener and a significant catalyst to bring the field together and catalyze this field forward as much as we can. So how do we come about this? This slide probably is the most important operating slide of Hevolution. We think of this as a value chain, starting all the way to the left, and by design, public opinion. The average citizen is confused by us. What, are we talking about longevity, health span, living forever, a few billionaires getting together saying, I'm going to go figure out how to keep myself alive, all the way through what does it mean when I'm 25 years old versus when I'm 60 years old. We need to engage the media sector into helping get everybody on the same page. We understand that. We're engaged with them. Policymakers need to understand the imperative and the importance of taking this on. Indeed, all the way to what does this mean for legislature? There is no regulatory path in any country that I know of today that will allow a drug to come to market for aging. Not one. So while we do have drugs going to clinic, they're all going for a disease with a hope that they would be used off-label for aging. That's a good step forward, but it's not a scalable model. We have to figure this out, and we have to figure this out with the legislature. We're engaged with multiple countries and regulators to start to think about this. What are the ethics of this? Who gets access? Who doesn't get access? What is okay to do? What is acceptable? What is not acceptable? What sort of genetic engineering, cloning? You take it. We have to get the ethics ahead of this. So we're convening some of the top ethicists in the world under Hevolution to actually start to debate the issue. This is led by Arthur Kaplan, who's professor at NYU, Julian Salvucci from Oxford, several others coming together to say, what are the bioethical issues around this field that hasn't happened to the level, in our opinion, that it needs to happen ahead of the curve, not afterwards. We're talking to funding agencies, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're engaging, but also how we're contributing. Of course, the universities we're engaged with, I'll show you some numbers, the biotechs, but also big pharma. If we're ultimately going to scale this into the marketplace, I mean, look with the COVID vaccine. It happened because big pharma leaned in and scaled it. You're going to need to partner. This is not an us or them. How do we get them to do? How do we get big pharma to really make this a priority? Put their resources behind it. Invest in it. It's going to be good for the entrepreneurs because if they believe it, they'll acquire those companies. They'll bring them in. Remember, 50-60% of their pipeline is through acquisitions and partners. And so we need them at the table. They're likely not present in this room. They need to be. And the question we have to ask is how? And ultimately, how do you bring them drugs to market? Our activities to date, on the funding side, and I'm not proud of this, but I'm going to say, let me explain why I'm not proud. Today, Hevolution has already committed over $250 million US to research, as research grants to universities and laboratories around the world. That's in the last 18 months. We are now the second largest funder of geoscience and aging biology on the planet, second only to the US government. I'm not proud of that. Why? Because the fact that that is the second largest number is nowhere near where it should be. We should get European Union, the German government, the British government, the US government, other Asian countries stepping up their investment to generate the pipeline of science and to train the scientists of the future that are going to be the drivers of the ideas that entrepreneurs can invest in. If you compare this to cancer, to rare diseases, to any of the other major diseases, cardiovascular, diabetes, we're a rounding error. Let me give you a number. The US NIH's budget is $44 billion annually. $4 billion is the National Institute of Aging, just 10%. Half of that goes to one disease. Of that remaining $2 billion, less than half goes to the biology of aging. That's 5% of the US budget. 70% of US healthcare costs are age-related diseases. Where's the mismatch? I suspect the same is true for Germany, European Union, the UK. I don't have those numbers at my fingertip, but I suspect the same. That needs to be addressed. I'm not saying reduce the rest, but you're paying trillions of dollars of GDP costs because of that. In terms of our grants and biotech investments, we have 158 scientists around the world that are now funded by Hevolution. All over the world, including European Union, UK, Asia, and of course North America. Our goal is to continue to accelerate that, and I would hope that 2-3 years from now, I'm talking about 500 plus, would be funded. I'm hoping as a result of the activity we're doing, it's actually quadruple because governments have figured out that this is a really good investment and we're going to get behind it in their own national institutions. When we provide a research grant, by the way, we ask for no IP, no royalties, no strings attached. We do not believe that funding science should come with strings attached. We're a nonprofit. We want to grow the field. We want entrepreneurs to license that science and then come at it. And then the institutions, we've created partnerships. One of the first was to partner with American Federation of Aging Research to manage our grants programs. The Buck Institute was one of our first multi-year partnerships. We're very proud of that. They stepped up to the plate and literally showed the way to everybody else. National Academy of Medicine. If you now start to look at the new ones, Albert Einstein, Northwestern, several more. I can tell you there's about 8 to 10 more partnerships already in the pipeline. These are from 3 years to 5 years, from 10 million to tens of millions of dollars of investment from us with these institutions. I know we're in Europe. These are North American institutions, which is where we started. We're in negotiations with a UK entity, European entities. All those are in the pipeline as we continue to grow so that we can fund these institutions with two goals, not only to move the science, but also to attract scientists to come into that institution to take aging on as a challenge. When I was a graduate student and postdoc, it was all about, can I go into cancer? Can I go into diabetes? I happen to go into endocrinology. We need to change and make this very attractive for young scientists, which means we've launched the first postdoctoral program globally to train postdoctoral students, providing up to 4 years of funding. The first 12 positions have just been funded, and they're actually right now going through evaluation. And we want to match those postdoctoral students with these institutions so they can be trained as the next generation. And ultimately, Global Health Span Summit, we planned on 500 people coming together in this field in Riyadh last year. Several of you in this room were there. Mike Torres, who's sitting in this room, called me 3 days before the event and said, we've had 2,000 people register, I don't have any more space. We had to close registration at 2,000. I have no doubt, had I let them continue registering, we could have gone to 3,000 plus, who traveled from all over the world. Not one speaker was given a single penny of honorarium. Not one. Vast majority, over 90%, covered their own expenses to come. Whether you were coming from private sector or public. Only people whose expenses were covered were academicians in universities whose universities understandably can't afford to pay for their travel. Other than that, and we still had 2,000 people come. Everything from chairmen of major companies like GSK down to startups with a new idea. That told me nothing else other than there is a demand for this field to convene, and it's right at that juncture to get going. Our job was to convene it, and we did. Next one is February 25, literally 11 months or 10 months from now. I'm not worried about it because Mike's on top of that. I'm sure he'll make it happen. Now, how do we work? Our operating model is shown on this slide. We want to have impact, as you can see at the top. I personally believe you cannot have impact until you have scale. You cannot scale until you create leverage. And you cannot create leverage until you actually collaborate. Our operating model is this slide. We put this together for that simple reason, to tell my team and our partnerships, if you actually want to have impact, look to the right. You've got to collaborate. If you collaborate, you will create leverage. If you create leverage, you'll actually have the scale. No one organization and no one country can solve this on their own. And only with that scale, enabled by collaboration, will you actually have the impact you need. So finally, let me leave you with this. Only together can we overcome probably the greatest challenge facing humanity on the planet today. The population of the world is about 8 billion. It's going to stabilize around 9 billion. 1 billion are over the age of 60. 2050 it will be 2 billion. It will continue to go there. However, in a pay-forward system like in Germany, when the workers were paying taxes are supporting the retirees, when that worked, when the Germans who defined the age limit for aging, I thank you for that, was done, if you recall, in the early part of the 20th century, the definition of old was 65. Why? Because about 1% of people lived to be past 65. So that was great. We promised to take care of you when you retire. Only 1% of you got there, so who's going to worry about it? When 40 or 50% are going to have to do it, and your pyramid has gone from this to that, and now this, we have a social, financial, human imperative. However, it's not just a challenge. It's a massive opportunity of the trillions of dollars of GDP for the public sector, the private sector, entrepreneurs and corporations, enabled by science and academicians, underpinned by credible science, that can be solved. It has been demonstrated clearly in animals, started to be demonstrated in humans, with one major gap left that I want you to leave with a question. We cannot accelerate this field if we cannot move the ability to measure the aging process efficiently and accurately without having to wait until we see how long you live. It's going to need 3 criteria. Number 1, can that biomarker, whatever it is, measure your biological age today? We have some of that. Does it predict the rate at which you're going to age in the future? Because if it can't predict, I don't want to know your biological age. It's got to tell me, actually can predict how fast you're aging, what is the gradient. And then the third, does it reverse with therapy? Because if it's not corresponding to a therapeutic response, I cannot put it into a trial and use it as a surrogate. There is to date no validated biomarker or combination of biomarkers that can give me all 3. And until you have those 3, then we can't do that. So what did we do at Hevolution? We partnered with the X Prize. We announced the world's largest ever prize, $150 million commitment, of which the first prize is $85 million approximately. We're committed $100 million in that X Prize. We're the single largest funder of that X Prize, simply to show if you can take a human population and demonstrate you can slow its age, that population down, you get $85 million if you win. That's big enough to attract. I hope dozens of European teams compete for that prize. Secondly, we appointed an endpoints committee to define what is winning mean, which means how you measure. And I'm grateful to him. Professor Patrick Maxwell from Cambridge agreed to co-chair the endpoint committee as an independent leading academician from UK/Europe to be co-chair so that we can define what is it winning mean, which means the endpoint, which is now forcing the field to ask the question, how do I measure if you won? Okay? Without waiting 30 years. So we're doing everything we can. I invite each of you to join us, and I thank you for the work you're doing. This is important, but we can achieve it, and we will win. Thank you very much.